So, Leon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You're welcome. So, before we really get into it, could you put a few words on your own background?
Yeah, sure. So I have a secondary education background mostly. I worked for 15 years in secondary school leadership. Um, Finished up in 2022 and started my PhD in generative artificial intelligence and education and the consulting work that I do now. So mostly my experience with these technologies is from an educational background, but my methods, my teaching background is English literature. So I really look at them from the perspective of an author, creator, and my interest is in how other educators who work in similar roles use these technologies.
So, overall, are you positive or are you negative concerning the next few years and AI's impact in education?
It normally depends on which day of the week you ask me. I sort of swing wildly from optimistic to quite cynical and quite concerned about the technologies. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the ethical concerns and some of the legal concerns, but I really think that there's great potential, and then there's also huge, potential pitfalls.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of hype surrounding AI in general, and also especially surrounding its use in education. Something like AI tutoring and personalized learning is one of the few topics that people are very excited about. There's also a lot of skepticism about. So if we take a look into the future, let's say 2 to 3 years, um, where do you think that AI will make its biggest impact for, let's just say, elementary school and high school and for school students in general?
Yeah, I'm really optimistic about some of the multimodal capabilities of generative AI. So I really like to look at that intersection between, not just text generation, but the text to speech, speech to text, some of the audio image generation, image recognition, and how those technologies converge. Because I think that will give students a lot of opportunities to engage with school in different ways. So I'm thinking like an accessibility technology, like for students with any kinds of additional needs, but also just in general to make the curriculum, make the materials, make everything that we do in secondary education more accessible to all students. So I'm less interested in, homework chatbots and tutor bots and those kinds of things, but I'm really interested in some of those potential uses of multimodal AI for making the curriculum more accessible.
I see. Okay. And on the other hand, so you say you're kind of you have mixed feelings about the AI's future in the education system. So if we look at like the next 2 years, so there'll be impacts from the teacher's perspective and also from the student's perspective. So a lot of students use generative AI to cheat on essays, for instance. And this has been one of the most hotly debated topics since ChatGPT was released. Uh, and honestly, I can understand it. If I was a student and had access to this technology, it would be quite difficult to not use it. It's very tempting and it's very easy, especially with take-home assignments and such. Um, what's your view on the matter? Like, how do you believe that? Do you think it's something that schools should? You obviously don't think the schools should ban ChatGPT. How can schools and school administrations embrace ChatGPT and this generative AI technology and still like support students' learning? Could you give a quick insight on that?
Yeah, if I could answer that question briefly, I think I'd be a very wealthy man. It's the biggest question in K to 12 and in higher education at the moment, and there's some great work coming out of various places, particularly in higher education, about how we have to rethink assessments. And back in November 2022, when ChatGPT was released, the biggest narrative around education was, oh no, here's this thing. Students are going to use it to cheat. It's the end of high school English. It's the end of the essay. It's the end of everything. And there's an element of truth in that. As you say, there are students using it to kind of cheat in little bunny quotes in inverted commas, because I think we have to reframe what we think cheating is, and we also have to reframe why we assess certain things, how we test the knowledge of students, and so on. So how do we know, how do we as educators know that learning has happened in some way? And that's a line that I've taken from Jason Lodge at TEXA, which is an Australian tertiary education um, authority, and I think that's really important. I think over the years that I've worked in education, a decade and a half in secondary education, we've assessed students' learning primarily by getting them to write an essay at the end of a unit of work, and that doesn't work anymore. I don't know if that's worked for a very long time. It hasn't worked for a lot of students. It certainly doesn't work for the majority of students. But what ChatGPT and all of those other applications have done is they've kind of gone, okay, yeah, this is ridiculous. Now there's an AI that can just do that for students. Why wouldn't they use it? So we have to figure out ways to work alongside the technology, sometimes to push back against the technology, but to acknowledge that it's not going anywhere.
And it's very different from a calculator because I imagine the teachers and the media and such was also very scared about calculators when they first came out. People were afraid that people would lose their ability to do arithmetic. But ChatGPT is a lot more generalized technology, and it can actually, replace human knowledge in many areas, which is why it's a different game changer compared to calculators and other similar learning technologies in the past. This is something I'm a bit concerned about. If we combine AI's impact with the impact of, say, TikTok and other social medias, and we teach students to rely a lot on generative AI to do their work in general, maybe students' learning in general will decline. This is also something I saw a study about. I think it was 3 weeks ago or something like that. It was published about how generative AI could impact learning. And the interesting thing was that students using GPT-4 at an exam, of course, they performed a lot better. But then it did an test exam afterwards where they tested the same students' ability to answer the questions without GPT-4, and their performance was something like 17% worse, as far as I recall. So it just goes to show that, of course, GPT-4 and other solutions can teach students to better their performance. But if they lose those abilities as soon as they don't have access, then that might be a problem. Is this something that you have thought about?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I published a paper. I was co-author on a paper last year with Jason Lodge, who I've mentioned, and Philip Dawson, who's an academic here, and another author from University of Queensland. The article was called "It's Not Like a Calculator." So, so that was us trying to articulate that it's not just another tool, it's not just another not it's not an app, it's not just like an iPhone or whatever. It's a system level change. And it's, as you mentioned, a general purpose technology which has much broader scope than just, it can do X, Y, and Z. It can write an essay or whatever. And I think we're going to have to come to terms with that. One thing I think is that there will be some skills loss. I don't think that's anything we can do about that, really. If we look at, let's take calculators for an example, and people's mental arithmetic has declined since calculators. That's well researched. If we look at GPS, Google Maps, and other apps like that, people's geospatial awareness has declined since those apps have been released. People can't navigate their own hometowns anymore without their phone. But we also know that when those skills decline, something else comes in its place. And sometimes it's just the technology replaces the skill one for one. But if we think about calculators, students in secondary school can now do much more advanced mathematics than they could when they were reliant on mental arithmetic or log tables or handwritten methods. So, things kind of balance out, I think, in the long run. And that's where I'm optimistic with AI. I think there will be some skills loss, particularly around written language skills, spelling, punctuation, grammar. There will be some skills loss there, but there'll also be gains, perhaps, in the way that we interact with technologies, in things like oral skills, the ability to speak and argue and construct an argument. We can do a lot of that verbally and also with AI. So it doesn't necessarily need to replace the skills one to one. There can be a both and kind of solution.
Yeah, hopefully it will increase people skills. That's one of the skills that's very difficult to teach in a classroom. And it's also something that, of course, is very important, especially nowadays with all the technology. So one thing I saw on your website is that you have you've divided the ethical issues of AI into 9 different categories. Um, which of these ethical concerns are you most worried about?
Yeah. And I had to narrow it down to nine. I think I started off with about 26. Um, so it's an ethically complex technology. All technologies are ethically complex. Google search is complex. Cars, any kind of technology has an ethical component. But for AI, out of those nine, I think the bias issue is the most pressing one to deal with. It's the one with the biggest implications on a societal level, and it's also the one that's get talked about the most. It's really front and center in public discourses around AI. Most people by now who've had anything to do with ChatGPT or image generation or any of that, they know that the technologies can be biased. And I think that's a good thing. It's raised awareness of those issues.
Hmm. And that's also partly another concern in that regard is that AI is developed in a very closed environment. It's a few big companies right now that are doing it. We have Microsoft, Meta, and Google. And one part which has been a heated discussion in my part of the world is why these technology companies have such a strong grip on the education system. Like if you go to any school, either use Google or Microsoft. Those are the two options. We don't really have any alternative. And I could imagine something similar happening with AI and edtech, that we might only have a few vendors in the future. We have to choose among one of those. Then we also privatize the education system to a large extent. That also might be different from country to country. In Denmark, we have a very public school system, whereas I think as in Australia, you have a bit more privatized education sector, as far as I recall. So
Yeah.
it's also different, of course, from country to country.
Although
That's another
even
thing.
sorry, even in Australia we have three main sectors. We have the independent sector, the Catholic sector, and then the state government sector. But all three of those sectors, just like your context, are really heavily reliant on those two ecosystems of Microsoft and Google. And I know that one thing that a lot of critical academics over here are doing, and I'm thinking Cole Perrotta and Neil Selwyn of Monash University, for example, they do a lot of work around critiquing and investigating and exploring the control that those kinds of organizations have within the education system. And I think this is global. I think I'd certainly speak for my context here in Australia, but also I know colleagues in the US and in the UK that are between those two major platforms as well. And one way I've heard it expressed is this kind of platformatization of education, which I think is a great way of thinking of it. If we think of platforms over the last 10 years, we have big platforms like Facebook. You mentioned TikTok earlier, Google, Microsoft. The logic of platforms is very much, at odds, I think, with a lot of aspects of education. Platforms scale, platforms deal with network effects, platforms deal with the kind of capture of members and the building of communities behind closed walls. A lot of that is really the antithesis of what many of us feel education should be.
Hmm. Do you think this is something that will change? Again, I know it's different from country to country, but at least that's the impression I have here in Denmark. We usually had a big case called the Google Chromebook case, where our public authorities they said basically that a group of students in a school could not use Google Chromebook anymore because of some data concerns. Technically, the Google Chromebooks were sending some kind of support data to Google. So it was not even very, vulnerable information it was sending to Google servers. It was more just, technical technical data about how they were using their computers. But still, that was a bit concerning to the public authorities because we don't know actually what that data is used for. So it has been a bit of a public discussion because, on one hand, uh, we're so embedded in using Google systems, and it's so impractical to switch. We have to build something with open source tools from scratch, and it will be a huge investment. So the price of convenience for using Google is quite high.
Mhm.
Um, it's super dependent on them.
Yeah, it is similar over here in this context as well. And I think one thing that does differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and this is, I guess, where my world intersects with yours, is you have things like the GDPR, which can be used as leverage against tech companies. Australia doesn't at the moment have an equivalent, although our privacy laws are currently under review. I think they're going to be revisited in 2025, and the word on the street is that they'll be pulled more closely aligned with GDPR than the kind of US equivalent, which is I think where they're closer to at the moment. So that's a really interesting conversation. What happens when we have school systems using these, whether it's software or hardware or combination platforms, which are doing all kinds of things with data. That can be hugely problematic. But because the laws are so different from one jurisdiction to the next, it's really murky. Um, and we're already seeing part of the biggest problem with generative AI, if we think about the input side rather than the output, are those copyright concerns and some of those issues around fair use and whether you can actually use these models ethically and legally. And a lot of that is being driven by what is true in US law and then applied globally, where laws, as you know yourself, obviously are very, very different. So it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out in terms of things like data, privacy, regulations, copyright, intellectual property, because at the moment it's very much the tech companies that are based in the US seem to be driving the narrative from within the US, and then that's having implications across the rest of the world. The European Union, from what I see, is the only jurisdiction that's really doing a serious job of pushing back against that narrative. It'd be interesting to see if Australia adopts that too.
Yeah, I at some level I kind of hope so. Um, to get some pushback. Otherwise, big tech companies will just make up their own rule book completely. So at least some resistance, I think, is healthy. So do you mostly consult school administrators, or yeah, first of all, is it mainly teachers, or is it like school administrations, or what's your target group for your consulting service?
That started off originally as just working with educators on the ground, doing professional development, training, what is AI, how to use it kind of work. But over the last 18 months, that's changed. Mostly now working with school leadership, working with higher education. I also work with businesses because most businesses are in the same point as education, where most of the staff haven't really had time or the inclination to familiarize themselves with the technologies. So yeah, I work across a whole range of sectors now, but particularly with leadership, sort of executive or even board level. around things like what the technology is, what it can do, what are the risks, what are some of the ethical implications. And I think what I found really nice is because I'm studying my PhD, I have the time and the flexibility to stay at least half on top of how quickly everything is developing. Whereas most people, people don't have a chance of staying on top of the AI developments because it seems like every 6 hours there's a new thing, a new research, a new platform, a new application, or it's really impossible to keep up. So that's my main job. It's just helping mostly leaders now to keep on top of all of these changes.
Makes a lot of sense. Um, I have been writing about this stuff for 1.5 years, 2 years, and sometimes it's really frustrating to keep up, even for me. And I've been doing it. I've been reading and writing about AI full time for a year, and it's really true that 6 hours is all it takes before some new development has arisen. So if I talk with someone or I wrote a post about something related to AI, it doesn't take more than a day, and then it's all invalidated because some new development happened. So it's really a full-time job to keep track of the development. And
Mhm.
also the school system is not known for its fast pace. It's more of like a slow machinery compared to the big tech companies. That's another and that's another thing also the courts and the legal systems have in common with the school systems. They are pretty slow runners, and there's also a danger there of the big tech companies just circling too many laps around the education system and the legal system, and it's not really possible to keep track of the new technological developments. So yeah, I definitely think it's important to stay in the loop. What's some of the typical issues or questions that you're faced with in your day job as a consultant?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's I'm often trying to do a bit of a review of what kinds of questions have landed on my doorstep in the past 2 or 3 weeks to see if it kind of changes over time. And increasingly, I work with international clients as well. So I have people in Northern Europe, in the UK, in the US, in Southeast Asia, and they're all asking the same kinds of questions, which I think is really interesting in itself. The questions are global questions, they're global concerns. Last year, the questions were, what is ChatGPT? What's this thing? And, is it a threat or is it a good thing? And can I use it? Um, you know, some of the bigger picture ethical questions like bias and uh, I guess the control of the technologies. That was maybe 12 months ago. 6 months ago, that started to shift to, okay, I kind of understand what ChatGPT is now. Can you help me to understand how to use it really well for my context? What does the technology do now that it couldn't do 6 months ago? What are the developments? And just recently, I've started to notice a lot more people paying attention to things like copyright and some of I guess, the more legal, ethical sides of things rather than the big picture human ethics. And I think that's driven by, big splashy court cases like the New York Times versus OpenAI and Microsoft, like the RIAA and Suno and Udio, the music generation platforms. Um, so yeah, it's been really interesting over time to see how people's questions have shifted from the bare bones kind of what is it technical, practical questions through to the more advanced practical questions and now on to the ethical legal questions.
Do you personally have a take on the copyright question when it comes to AI? Do you think that these companies should seek permission to train on other people's data?
Yeah, I've got personal opinions and I get into trouble on LinkedIn because I post my personal opinions and then intellectual property lawyers jump into the conversations and tell me to get back into my wheelhouse, which is fun.
Classic lawyers.
And look, I like to think that as an educator, I've sort of had my own experience with copyright over my career, and what you might call sort of educational statutory fair dealing in Australia or fair use elsewhere, perhaps. As an author myself, I have those opinions on copyright, and I think that gives me a personal stance on copyright, which is that the companies developing artificial intelligence should be licensing um, licensing data from the creators that are being used to develop these models. Now, I know that there are technical limitations with that. I know that there are kind of, societal limitations even and legal limitations. And I know that to the letter of the law at the moment, the jury's out in the US over whether training these models constitutes fair use, whether it's transformational or transformative purposes. All of that stuff is still up in the air. For me, it's not a legal question, it's a moral question. You want to take somebody's stuff, you pay for it. And there are companies doing that, or at least trying to do the right thing. You might have seen Ed Newton Rex's fairly trained certification body and the work that they're doing to certify developers that can prove that they have licensed their data sets appropriately. So, it's always moving and shifting. I think over the long term, the next few years, we will see a lot more small niche models with smaller data sets that have been licensed. I think that will be a positive. But I also don't think anybody's going to wind the clock back and make OpenAI and Google and Microsoft, disgorge their algorithms or start again from scratch. I think that ship has sailed, if I'm being pragmatic.
Mm. And also now that the technology is implemented in iPhones and such, it's just
Yeah.
all over the place. It's already deeply integrated in our lives. So it's hard to turn the clock back, as you say. And
And
that's
that is
another
the
thing.
well, that is the business model, isn't it? That's regulatory entrepreneurship or whatever you want to call it. Move fast and break things and then get too
Mm.
big to ban. It's
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
it's been the model since Facebook's inception. It's been the model since long before that of tech companies to madly kind of produce things which are sometimes in ethical or legal gray areas to make that technology public, to make it free, to build up a huge user base, to get a lot of venture capital investment, and then to use that VC investment to fight off the inevitable lawsuits that come from people like RIAA, Sony, New York Times, whatever. It's not a new business model, but it's certainly the business model of generative AI.
Mm. And there's also a lot of history regarding the regulators' fight with tech companies. The problem is, of course, that the lawsuits take many years, and the
Mhm.
tech companies have a lot of leverage. For instance, let's say a school or a university wants to use ChatGPT and wants to implement it in their education. It's really hard to step the foot down and say, we're not going to use your generative AI unless it's probably uh, um, legally correct, licensed. It's really hard to step the foot down and say, we're not going to use your generative AI unless you license it properly. Then they'll just say, okay, bye. There really is not a lot of uh, leverage, not for
Yeah.
the universities, not for the schools, not for the public sector in general. So it's either comply or goodbye kind of situation.
And
Yeah.
that's definitely happening with publishing companies. We're seeing news publishing companies like the body that owns the Atlantic in the US, for example, like News Corp, the Australian-owned international news corporation, which owns all of Australia's biggest newspapers, but is also, Fox News in the US. And all of those companies are now making deals, which some people are calling sort of, devil's bargains with companies like OpenAI to license data. And I mean, I saw this great post on, I think it was on Twitter originally, on X. And I can't remember who it was originally that said this, but it's almost like a thief has broken into your house, stolen all of your stuff, and then come back a week later with a note saying, "Can you just let me know what you don't want me to steal in the future, and I'll respect that from now on. I promise." It's really really hard for me to trust these companies. OpenAI willingly and knowingly scraped all of that data, built a model, produced a platform which can be used in competition with authors, and is now going back to the publishers and saying, "Hey, we've ran out of data, but guess what? We'll pay you this time if you allow us access to your resources." So, maybe that's a little bit cynical, but this is the way of things.
It really is an example of big companies making the law, and bypassing all the democratic processes. It's fascinating and also a bit scary, and it's a very complex topic. So, do you think this is something that students should be taught from an early age?
Yeah, I mean, the issue that we always have in secondary education in my context is that there's so much in the curriculum already. Like, where do you fit this stuff? We're teaching history, we're teaching maths, we're teaching science, we're teaching English, we're teaching languages, whatever. Where do we put in AI ethics, or where do we put in discussions of copyright and intellectual property with technologies? So I think one thing we have to do is, we have conversations with students, maybe within the frameworks of subjects that we already teach. So, I'm an English teacher. I teach a lot of media. Maybe within a media subject, I can talk about things like, ownership and media monopolies and all of those kinds of ideas. And I can bring AI into that. And then for other teachers, maybe they talk about the AI issues in their own context. So, health, physical education teachers, for example, could talk about some of the issues with algorithms in healthcare. Teachers in mathematics can talk about some of the technical constraints. Teachers in the sciences can talk about some of the ethical and technical concerns. So I think the way that we approach AI has to be to distribute it throughout some of our existing curriculums, and to allow teachers who are experts in those subject areas to bring their own kind of nuances to that discussion.
Hmm. And so you teach. What is your students' viewpoint on AI in general? Are they excited, or are they scared, or are they neutral, or what's the sentiment?
Yeah, so I mean, now that I'm out of the classroom, I normally interact with students when I'm working in a client's school, and I'll do student workshops and forums or even just surveys and things. So I hear from a lot of different teenagers, mostly adolescents, grade 8, year 9 kind of students. And honestly, a lot of what they're telling me is that they really couldn't care less about AI.
Okay,
Um,
that's a bit surprising.
yeah, look, I had a year 9 girl talk about the Snapchat AI chatbot. And she said it was cringe, and yeah, a lot of her friends sort of hate the chatbot that's inside the app, and it's really hard to get rid of. And the Facebook, the Meta one that's been released in the last couple of months, is sort of equally frowned upon by teenagers. They don't want these AI chatbots kind of maneuvering their way into their chat threads and things like that. They see it as a, you know, I don't know, just a sort of dull, uninteresting technology. The other aspect is, of course, in education, whenever teachers tell students that there's a technology that might be useful, that's a great way of convincing teenagers not to use something.
Hmm.
Um, I think really what will happen, what's more likely is young people's use of this technology will increase as the technology kind of disappears into the background. So, as things like Meta AI become more seamless within their platforms, people will be using them and not even really thinking of it as AI. Sort of, it recedes into the woodwork. The same way with all of our existing systems. Like, you pick up a phone, you don't think of the phone network. You pick up, you connect to the internet. You don't think of yourself anymore as like connecting to the internet or going online or anything, because the internet is just all around us. And I think AI will be the same. It will recede. People will use it uncritically, unknowingly, and that has its own risks as well. But that's the way this technology seems to be going.
So let's say, to move all the way back to the start almost. If in 1 or 2 years, do you think that generative AI will be widely used in the schools, in general?
Yes, I think what will happen over the immediate future, over the next couple of years, is that we'll see an increase in those AI assistant technologies that just become integrated into the platforms we already use. So Copilot in Microsoft 365, Gemini in Google Docs, Slides, Gmail, all of those kinds of integrations, which at the moment mostly come with a premium kind of fee or an enterprise license. I think that they will become free education products. And we'll see things like Khan Migo from Khan Academy in the States, the education tutor chatbot. They've just been bankrolled by Microsoft, which seems again to be part of the business strategy at the moment of the big companies, is to finance large non-profits and then to use that as a way to get a foot in the door. So we're going to see products like Khan Migo growing in increasing prevalence. We're going to see tutor bots and things like that in classrooms, almost whether we want them there or not. So it will become ubiquitous. It will, to an extent, recede into the background of just the everyday technologies that we use. And I think we've got now, in the short term, maybe 18 months, 2 years, we've got an opportunity to kind of critique and push back and make sure that this technology does what we want it to do and not just what the technology companies think it should do.
Good point. So we have to let our voices be heard now, because in a couple of years it might be too late. We'll just be rolled over by the big tech companies. Makes a lot of sense. You also said, just to go back again, that one of your biggest ethical concerns is bias. What can school systems and students particularly do to mitigate this bias issue? And what is the bias issue in your words?
The biggest issue with bias in AI is that all data is biased. We collect data, and when we choose what to include and what to exclude, that creates bias. These language models are built on a huge scrape of the internet corpus. The internet is a biased data set. It has its own kind of demographics, and it doesn't include voices from every single community. And so, you build a model that understands the world, or understands or has a worldview comprised on all of that language, and you're encoding that bias into the models. And I think in terms of what schools can do, we don't have a lot of influence, as we've already said, over the product itself. We're not going to go to the tech companies and say, hey, you need to, create more diverse data sets, or you need to get rid of, delete all of the data from GPT-4 and start your training again from scratch. We don't have that power. So all we can do really is to educate people. And on a positive note, what I have seen is a lot more discussion of gender bias, racial bias, ageism, ableism, all of the kind of biases that are almost taken for granted in day-to-day society or ignored are being surfaced by AI. Because if you type photo of a CEO into image generation, it always gives you a young white man. Or if you type photo of a nurse, it always gives you a sexualized image of a young woman. And I think having this technology has raised awareness of those kind of systemic biases, which we've always known they're there, but this gives us a really great tool to actually talk about them in the classroom. And I think that's what schools are responsible for.
And that's also one of the advantages with open source, like Llama 3.1, the new model from Meta. Like, these kind of AI models can be more directly integrated by the schools and fine-tuned on their own data. I know that schools probably don't possess this knowledge right now to fine-tune AI systems, but maybe increasingly in the future it could be an advantage, because they have some control over what kind of data that goes into particular applications, and this RAG method, which also have received a lot of attention, where you can kind of put the AI model's output up on some secondary source. That could also have a lot of potential to maybe mitigate the bias problem, because that's one of the many concerns. Something I also know you have written about is like this black box issue. You can't really backtrack and say this is why the model made the output it did. Um, so in general, that's problematic that you have this technology that people will depend on increasingly in the future, but you can't really tell why it produces the results that it does. And that's also kind of against the scientific method, where there's a lot of scrutiny and focus on explaining the results very clearly. and a lot in depth. So in this way, it's kind of unacademic to rely on the conclusions without going through the discussions.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned Meta's the Llama 3.1 model. I've got Llama 3.1 running on this laptop, which is a MacBook Pro, runs seamlessly using
Wow.
the 8 billion parameter model, so the smallest version of the model. It'd be really interesting to see if organizations in education are able to, maybe deploy the 75 billion parameter model, or I can't imagine many schools using the 450 billion parameter model, which takes some kind of, absurd amount of compute just to get it running. But I can imagine schools being able, having the capacity, the kind of hardware, and I guess the technical understanding to run something like the 75B model internally, have a little bit more security over their data, have a little bit more ability to fine tune. But in my experience, the level of technical proficiency needed to do that within a school isn't, or a university, isn't high enough yet.
Mm,
Because data scientists and machine learning experts tend not to work in schools.
mm,
These are kind of bigger picture issues. I work with a lot of my client schools on their digital strategy. One issue that they always have is, um, their kind of talent bench for digital. They don't have necessarily people who are in expert roles at really high level. They have people who understand how the education systems work. They have people who can work with learning management systems, things like Microsoft Teams. They have people who've got expertise in server development and all of that kind of hardware side of things. But not many schools that I've worked with have got a high level of artificial intelligence or machine learning expertise. And I think that will become a really interesting in-demand area of employment in the near future in K to 12 and higher education as people start to experiment with things like open source and other variations on this technology beyond just using Microsoft Azure or using GPT.
and that's another thing, like the bias issue, that it raises an issue that was previously not very much talked about, suddenly to the public awareness, because it's also, as I see it, a bit problematic that we use computers, we use the internet, we use all of these things, and yet we have no idea how they're working. Like a Microsoft or Google PC, we can't take it for granted, the technical aspects. For instance, just yesterday there was a few there were a few programs I couldn't open on my computer. I couldn't access Zoom all of a sudden, and I had no idea how to fix that issue. So I spent half an hour trying to fix it, but I had no idea how to do it. So I had to restart the entire system, like kind of reboot the system. It's also make me think that it's problematic that we use all of this tech all the time, yet it's presented to us as something easy and it's user friendly and it's smooth running. But as soon as it's not working, we're completely helpless.
Mm.
So there's two things, particularly in let's just say the school sector, that we have to get more experts, technology experts to help, and also help to raise the general awareness of technology and how it's used. So we have a more realistic understanding of it, because it's also very easy for someone who's not an AI uh, what do you say, doesn't have any AI literacy, to understand. It's very easy, sorry, to convince a person that doesn't know a lot about this technology that is going to be super intelligent in a few years. It's very easy to make that person believe all kinds of lies about the technology if he or she doesn't know how it actually works. So this technology knowledge is something that, as I see it, we really have to teach to students.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a really important issue. I think, earlier you said that, well, the approach of AI and that kind of lack of transparency and the lack of being able to interrogate the output of generative AI is unacademic. And I think a lot of what you just said there is, again, kind of the antithesis of education. We're increasingly moving towards technologies and platforms which are unexplainable. And I've got an iPhone here. If this thing broke, if the battery suddenly exploded or something like that, I wouldn't even know off the top of my head how to take the back of this thing off. And I think back to when I was a child, I had a Sony Walkman, I pulled it to bits and I explored where all the little transistors and components and things were. And I used to love breaking technology apart. And now we're at the stage where most technology you can't even take the lid off, let alone understand its workings. I think an iPhone has something in the order of about 5 billion transistors on it. So as the technology increases in capability, it also becomes more and more abstract, and that carries its own risks. And then the other side of that, from an education perspective, in both K to 12 and higher education, is that increasing skills gap between the entry level jobs that AI is set to replace, and then the higher level jobs which are needed to understand the technology. And I'm really interested to know, like, how does a student leaving school now get that entry level experience if AI is going to be doing all of that work? We see an AI being used as a really proficient coder, proficient software development, and that will continue to increase. So what happens when the software or the code for technologies is being developed predominantly by AI? And then at the top end, we've got this huge gap between what actual humans can do with that knowledge. That's a really interesting problem, I think, that's going to become more important over the next 5 years.
I think sometimes that we need to do a trade-off with convenience versus control and ownership. That's my idea, like my vision. I'm not sure if it's going to manifest in the real world or not, but I kind of hope that we turn our backs just a little bit to these big tech solutions and instead begin to take some ownership and build our own, like the public sector and private people, build their own systems from scratch. I would love to see an alternative for Word or Google Docs. It's not that it's not working, it works perfectly fine, but it would be good to have an alternative. Maybe it could be better. Who knows? Everyone has been using either Word or the Microsoft Office or the Google Docs for at least the last 10 years. There's not really been any competitors. And that's what I would like to see, more options.
Mhm.
So
That's one of the big potential positives of this technology, I think, is that it might open up avenues for people to make their own software solutions or their own kind of applications and approaches to using things. So my research, my PhD research is concerned with that kind of multimodal generative AI and also how it helps people with design and creation of materials. And I use Claude, for example, to write a lot of code to do things that I couldn't do myself. And I might have to otherwise purchase expensive software to do. So, I can use Claude to write code that can make a, financial dashboard that I can run on my device offline with no internet connection that will do the same kinds of things as big accounting software with just a CSV of my financials for the last year. But I've built it myself. I've got a bit more fine-grained control over what it shows me and what I can do with that data. And I can run it privately and I'm not paying a, $40 a month subscription for the privilege. So, I'm optimistic that you've outlined there might be a really useful future way to use these technologies.
okay, Leon, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much.